Hi, NBJC family. I'm Victoria Kirby York, the Deputy Executive Director of the National Black Justice Coalition, the nation's only civil rights organization focused solely on the rights and empowerment of the Black, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer plus, and same gender loving community, people, and families. I am also a huge Pauli Murray fan. Like many of us, Pauli had a complex gender identity that we are all learning more about. We will do our best to refer to Pauli as Pauli, but may use she, he, or they from time to time to honor the diversity of Pauli's experiences navigating their gender identity. I first learned of Pauli during the celebrations of Howard University's 150th anniversary, where both of our alma maters presented Pauli with the posthumous honorary doctorate. After learning more about Pauli's legacy and impact on civil rights, women's rights, and ultimately the rights of LGBTQ plus and same gender loving people, I knew I needed to do all I could to ensure the rest of the world also learned about this fierce, gender non-binary Black feminist who set the stage for the major rights those of us marginalized by those identities have now. Today, I am so excited to introduce you to Julie Cohen. Hi, Julie.
Hi, Victoria.
Julie is one of the co-directors of a new documentary about the life of Pauli called My Name is Pauli Murray, which premiered earlier this year at the Sundance Film Festival. And it's rolling out to theaters all across the country this weekend. So buy your tickets. And for those of you still not quite going into movie theaters yet for safety reasons, it will also be on Amazon Prime Video, streaming beginning on October 1st. So get your watch party scheduled and ready.
Exactly.
So Julie, welcome to NBJC's Q&A. We are honored to have you.
I am honored and pleased to be here.
Yes, I I know you've directed other documentaries, and I love your focus on fierce feminists from a variety of different backgrounds. But what are you most excited about regarding the theatrical release of this film in particular?
Yeah, I think I might say that I'm maybe more excited for this film to get out into the world than any film I can recall being involved in. Just because there's so many people who are really hungry to learn more about Pauli Murray. And there are also those who aren't that familiar with Pauli at all. And that makes it a really exciting prospect, especially because I feel like viewers are going to have a similar experience in a way to what we had, because Pauli, among the many things that amazing things that Pauli achieved in life, Pauli had the really great foresight to think, like, people maybe aren't caring enough about me in my lifetime, so I am going to save all of this information and more for people in the, kind of speaking to the future. And Pauli saved not only all of these writings and drafts of legal papers and books, and personal diaries and notes, but more than 800 amazing photographs, and even about 40 hours of audio tape in Pauli's own voice, kind of explaining all kinds of things, reading poetry, talking about history, talking about the various civil rights, women's rights, labor, so many different struggles Pauli was involved in life. Also spirituality, like there's sort of so much. It's crazy. And then also a couple of videotapes that we found in working on this project. So we really were able to piece together a lot of Pauli's thinking in Pauli's own words. So I think the experience of making the film and the experience of viewing the film are both kind of like having Pauli speak to you. And I think that will be received very differently by different audience members, but like almost anyone, like if you have a heart and a brain, you're going to find it, I think, a really moving experience to have Pauli speaking to you.
I watched it when it premiered at Sundance, and you are 100% right. I can't imagine anyone not watching this film and hearing Polly's voice and not being first in awe of everything they were able to accomplish, but just also just kind of struck by the fact that Polly doesn't have statues all across this country and museum exhibits everywhere. And I do feel like this documentary is going to create so many opportunities for people to have their first introduction and meeting with Pauli, and to have it be in Pauli's own voice is so powerful. So I know now you know so much about Pauli from going through all this material. But when did you first learn about Pauli?
So, you know, that even that is a complicated question. We would say that we what spurred this film was learning a small amount about Pauli Murray from Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, from that about whom myself and my directing partner Betsy West made the film RBG, that came out 3 years ago. It was in the midst of researching that film that we learned that RBG had put Pauli's name on the cover as a co-author of the first brief RBG wrote for the Supreme Court, fighting for gender equality under the 14th Amendment. An idea that Pauli, like so many big ideas, an idea that Pauli had earlier than other very smart people. So we thought, that's interesting. And it was sort of really after the film, after RBG came out, that we started to learn more about what Pauli did. But here's why I say it's a complicated question and why it's an interesting thing about how we learn history. When I went back and looked at some feminism books that I had read in college, I discovered, because in fact one of them was edited by a consulting producer on this film, Patricia Bell Scott. When we first connected with Patricia, who's really, you know, one of the world's experts on Pauli Murray, and I saw that she had been a co-editor of this book that I remembered reading in college. I was like, Pauli must have been mentioned, and sure enough, Pauli was mentioned 3 or 4 times in that book. But you know, you actually need to be taught something a lot to really absorb it. And I was paying attention in that class. I liked that class, but like it's just a reminder of how much teaching we really have to do to learn.
Yes. That reminds me that I actually did learn about Pauli at Howard, but before, when I was a student as well. But they shared Pauli's name as her full legal name,
Anna Pauline
Murray.
Interesting.
And so, and they didn't really focus on what I consider to be some of these big, you know, powerhouse, impactful moments of their career. You know, we didn't learn about some of the Supreme Court cases and the influence on RBG and Thurgood Marshall. We did learn that, you know, they were really good friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, but not too much more than that. And it never clicked to me how much, or even that they were the same person, to be honest with you.
Right.
That Pauli Murray and Anna Pauline Murray were the same people, because their legacy was so much richer than anything I was taught in my freshman year. So in learning about all of this great information about Pauli's life, and upon finishing the documentary, were there any moments or lessons from Pauli's life that for you just kind of have stood out that you carry with you as you continue out in the world?
Yeah, I mean, there's really a lot of from this story that I feel I carry with me, and all of us that work on the film feel that way. In my case, I would actually say that what sticks with me the most is Pauli's poetry. Um, and I'm not even like, I don't necessarily always love poetry, but Pauli wrote so many really sort of richly evocative and emotional poems that make you rethink history, that make you like just look at the world in a whole different way. And lines from those poems, I feel like are, you know, popping up in my head all the time.
Yes, I love the one about words, and of course the one that their autobiography was written on.
Right. Right.
Song from a Weary Throat.
Right.
I have a question about weariness and chronic fatigue a little later, but the thing that struck me about the title was that it was both the title of the poem and also the autobiography is the metaphorical vision of having a song stuck when that you want to sing when
Right.
you are incredibly tired,
Right.
but also that there's hope there, right? That even
Right.
when you are at your most exhausted. And I personally battle with narcolepsy, which is similar but different from chronic fatigue. And what it just looking at the book title for the first time, it's back there somewhere. I was just it was one of those moments where I felt seen even before flipping through the pages, right?
Wow. Yeah.
Um, so, there's so much about Pauli's life that is hard to squeeze into such a limited amount of time. Um, from Pauli being the first Black Deputy Attorney General of California, right? Like half a century before Kamala Harris became Attorney General and subsequently Vice President of the United States. And, you know, uh, there's so many important milestones. The Murray memo that helped to solidify getting sex included in the
Right.
Civil Rights Act of 1964, guaranteeing protections for women in employment, and later, because of that provision, protections for LGBTQ plus people.
Right.
You talked about their impact on Brown versus Board of Education, and their impact on Ruth Bader Ginsburg and being able to fight for women's equality, but also the legal theory that underpinned Brown versus Board of Education and literally the dismantling of segregation and Jim
Right.
Crow in this country. I mean, just huge, mind-boggling things. And y'all were able to fit a whole lot into a small period of time, but of Pauli's achievements are there pieces that you're just like, we couldn't get this into the documentary, but if a biopic is made or a feature film is
Yeah,
made,
it's interesting. It's interesting you say that because I actually think, first of all, I think and hope that there will be more than one, narrative film treatments of Pauli's life or even series. I think there are so many episodes that we didn't, many that we did include that could be broadened, but I think more likely a film would probably drill down on a narrower piece of Pauli's life and could tell, more about that. I mean, some of the ones that you just mentioned are great as well. There was Pauli's work on trying to prevent an execution of sharecropper who had been convicted of murder, and what Pauli and other activists were arguing pretty convincingly was a self-defense case, a really interesting case, but a fairly complicated legal case. So it's not the kind of thing you could really mention without going into it, but that could make a whole cool movie. Pauli's incredible jumping in to the labor movement, and all of how that worked together. Pauli taking on the project in an era when, keep in mind, there was no Google, because that, where research was much different, where Pauli, hired actually by the Methodist Church at that time, was told to like compile a list of segregation laws in the American South. There were many, and it wasn't hard. It wasn't easy to catalog. So Pauli ended up writing a whole book on this subject, spent several years on it, researched it, like, incredible stuff. You could, that's an amazing story, and helped kind of prepare a roadmap for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund of like, hey, laws that we maybe want to think about overturning, like here they all are in a book. Let's just start going through them. I could get the 10-year battle at Brandeis, which we did get into in the film, but you could make a whole movie out of that. Like you could make a lot of good Pauli movies.
Oh my goodness. I do feel like a series is needed for sure. There's so much. I mean, I just can't think of too many figures in history where there's so much rich content, right, about their life, but also that's still so relevant, right? So many years later.
Right.
If you could pick any actress or actor
correct.
to play
Right.
Pauli
Yeah,
Murray,
yeah.
who would it be?
Yeah, I think that's probably too hard to question, because as you say, even the choice would be an it's actually one of the reasons that we don't have any actor reading Pauli's poetry. There's a bunch of Pauli writing that we didn't have audio of, that we chose just to show you the words because we didn't want to make a gender choice. Um, you know, Probably, I mean, I will say, an actress named Sharon Washington played Pauli in a small role in the narrative film about RBG on the basis of sex and did a wonderful job. So that's obviously someone who has great playing Pauli experience. But I think probably the choice of a trans or non-binary man would be the way to might be the way to go. Similarly, Pauli very consciously identified as being mixed race.
Yes.
So there's another, another whole acting, casting decision making. I'm glad I'm not the casting director.
No, I think about this all the time because I'm just like, the multiracial piece was so important, and one of the stories in her autobiography that I just kept coming back to was being at I think it was a train station and in the South, and white passengers walking by not knowing, is this a Black child who shouldn't be here, right, or is this a just a darker complexioned white child, so yeah, it does feel like a very critical part of their experience. It's like finding someone to play Mariah Carey. It's like that's an important aspect of who she is. So much has been discussed regarding Pauli's race, sex, gender identity, religious grounding, and leadership. The fact that Pauli was the first Black woman ordained in the Episcopalian church as a priest, is now a saint in the Episcopal church, which is amazing to me. And of course, Pauli's sexual orientation. But can you share a little bit more about Pauli's identity as a working poor person and also a person living with a chronic disability?
Yeah, I mean, those are fair descriptions of Pauli. I mean, actually, Pauli had a number of different medical and mental health issues throughout life that certainly played an ongoing role. I mean, it's hard to say that like those things stood in the way because Pauli actually did accomplish so much. But I think things might have been different if Pauli's various health troubles, thyroid problems and ongoing fatigue, frequent malnutrition, which of course is relevant to being a working poor person. I mean, Pauli had a fairly broad experience economically because at different points of life, Pauli was in a very different place on the economic spectrum. I think just yet another way that they had like a vantage point to sort of understand a bit more. There were, Pauli was never homeless in the sense of living on the streets, but Pauli often didn't have an actual residence. I mean, but by today's standards, we would say sort of couch surfing, which was some of what Pauli did. The number of it, there was a time when there was an FBI file on Pauli, which we saw, and at one point, like any civil rights or labor activist of Pauli's day, there was an FBI file on Pauli, and there was a whole section that just lists every Pauli residence, and it's unbelievable. It's like there are many, scores of them. Like every couple months, Pauli was moving somewhere else, and most of these places, as I say, often it was staying with someone else, and the amazing thing through all of that is Pauli's carrying around these first, a few, and then dozens, and then more than 100 boxes worth of everything with the thought of saving it for posterity. Even in periods where Pauli was, on the borderline of, hunger and really not having enough food to eat. Um, and also, not having a steady home. I mean, it's an extraordinary leap of faith.
Wow. And audacious, right?
And
Like
audacious.
just the thought of knowing, the world being able to witness the world catching up with you as
Yeah,
you age and knowing that, okay, they've caught up to this part of my life.
right.
I need
Yeah,
to make sure I leave the breadcrumbs to ensure the
right.
rest of it
Exactly.
is captured. I
Right.
mean, I love that. Some people would call it hoarding, because I do the same thing. I have a whole room filled with stuff I've kept over the years
Yes.
from
Oh, that's the archive.
the archive.
That's
Yes,
the
I love
archive.
it.
When the people show up to go through when the hoarding reality show comes over to look through your stuff to grab it, you're like, oh no, that's my archive.
Yes, I am an archivist.
Exactly.
Getting rid of that other word. So, do you have a favorite book or poem, article, report, or photo from Polly?
Yeah. So wow, there is a lot, but my favorite, and again, this is something that we briefly mentioned in the film, but really don't go into at all, is Pauli's book "Proud Shoes," the first book that Pauli had published. That is really a story from the Civil War and Reconstruction era, telling different strands of Pauli's family. And it's a combination of a memoir, but Pauli also did an enormous amount of research into all of this just incredible stuff in American history that, like, I didn't learn in my perfectly decent public school education. All kinds of really interesting things about black units serving in the Civil War, because her grandfather was one of those. The attempts just after the Civil War of leaders to educate black children in the South, like just and what happened and what those battles were like, just like incredible stuff that's not only Pauli's own family, but documenting like other people that they cross paths with. The book is fantastic. It's so deep into history that it's not stuff that there are images of. Again, it would make a great fiction film. There wasn't really much we could do in our documentary world, where we're looking both for images and for people who were alive at the time of certain things, who could tell you, like, we could have Eleanor Holmes Norton telling us what Pauli was like in law school, but there's really nobody to talk about like what things were like in Reconstruction. But it's an incredible book, one of the best books I ever read, and I recommend it to everyone.
Yes, it predated Roots by 2 decades.
Yes, and Pauli, exactly. It came out, I think, in 1957. Roots was probably like mid to late 70s, I'd say. Pauli, in one of the interviews we have, is actually talking about being deeply irritated by the fact that that book's publisher wouldn't reissue a paperback. Pauli saying, like, I've been trying to get them to do a paperback. The book got great reviews, including in the New York Times Book Review. It got some notice, was not a huge bestseller. But Pauli's thought was, like, people, in the 50s, people may not have been interested, but like, hey, by the early 70s, wouldn't be. And then once Roots came out, I think there may have been a paperback that came out, but then it became as if Pauli was being derivative of Alex Haley, when really, as always, Pauli was like decades ahead.
Yes, always decades ahead. That could be a colon for
Right,
Pauli.
right,
Or Pauli did it first, right?
right,
Pauli did the lunch counter sit-ins in DC many years
right,
before
right,
Greensboro. Pauli
right,
refused to give up their seat on the bus, a decade or so before Rosa Parks.
right.
You're right. Pauli did it first. um, Thank you for that. Especially, right now, Ancestry just released all of the data from the Freedmen's Bureau for free for people to really be
Wow.
able to dig into their
Thank
family history. Black folks, white folks, and everybody alike,
yeah.
has some relatives that are in some of these Freedmen's Bureau archives that have now been fully digitized. And I think, Polly's book, Proud Shoes, the memoir of of their family, is such a good way for people to start to get steeped into it. I do a lot of family genealogy, and one of the statistics that I always keep with me in talking to other Black people is that 80% of Black folks whose families descended from slavery have a significant portion, at least 20% or so of white DNA. And so in terms of these multiracial families, and all of it, to Pauli's point in their book, were not always forced
Right.
sexual relationships.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting. Different branches of Pauli's family having different having different stories of how the races became interconnected. Some of which are more trauma clearly trauma based than others, but some seeming affairs, although certainly not in circumstances that would have promoted complete freedom all around. So anyway, really fascinating though.
One question that I have, just kind of on this piece of memoir biography, there are a number of books now out that seeks to also tell Pauli's story. Do you have a favorite or a book that you consider to be the best companion to the film?
That's a little hard to say since the books have really different points of orientation. Patricia Bell Scott's book that tells the story of Pauli, and also a part of sort of the Eleanor Roosevelt's evolving view towards civil rights, I would say, and marries those two stories, called The Firebrand and the First Lady, is incredible. The book Jane Crow, which you have behind you, by Rosalind Rosenberg, which is really the first major exploration of both sexual orientation and gender identity as it relates to Pauli. So both of them are fantastic. Although Pauli's own writing is just highly, like, I just, like, you need to, as soon as you see the movie, you got to just start reading. There's a lot of good stuff to read. The poetry collection Dark Testament is also really amazing.
One of the things that stick with me about the poetry, Pauli has shared that their dream was to be a writer.
Yes.
But Pauli had to spend so much energy fighting all of these barriers because of all of what Pauli represented, being this Black, gender nonconforming, same gender loving woman. Today, we probably would say transgender identified person, that they're so much of their writing, which was really what they wanted to invest their career in, was kind of became a side project in the fight for being able to be fully seen and to have full rights in this country took such center stage. So, last question. Our Q&A has come to an end. I've so enjoyed being able to talk with you. If Pauli were alive today, what message do you think Pauli would have for us?
Well, Pauli's message throughout life was always about looking forward and starting and pushing the fights that would have meaning in the future. So I do think Pauli's message would be to keep fighting, but to fight in such a way that could broaden. Pauli was definitely a believer in making common cause with many people. It's a little hard to imagine how Pauli would handle our current, like, painfully polarized country, where it kind of feels like it sometimes feels like reconciliation, like, kind of isn't the way to go right now. Frankly, that was never the message that Pauli was saying in life, and including in some parts where younger people interviewing her or interviewing Pauli were very specifically asking that very question, like, should we be working with broad coalitions? Pauli's answer was always yes. Would that be still true today? It's hard to know, but I definitely think keep fighting would be part of that message.
I love that. Keep fighting. Let's leave our conversation on that note. Thanks for joining me, Julie. Everyone watching, please support the film by safely going to theaters, showing it starting Friday, September 17th and on to Amazon Prime Video for streaming on October 1st. Remember, get those watch parties going. Ensure that everybody across the world has the opportunity to get to know who Pauli Murray was and the spirit and legacy that still is. If you're using social media to discuss the film, feel free to use hashtags like my name is Pauli Murray or hashtag Pauli Murray. Are there any others, Julie, folks should be following?
Nope, those are the ones.
Awesome. And you can also follow Julie Cohen, our fabulous guest, on Twitter at Filmmaker Julie. Remember, you can follow NBJC on all of our social media platforms at NBJC on the Move and at www.nbjc.org to learn more and to donate. Thank you so much for being a part of this edition of NBJC Q&A. I'm Victoria Kirby York, and it was a pleasure to be with you all this evening.